that's a picture from a backyard. That is a picture of a agapostымен bee, a very common species in Ontario, and actually it is Toronto's official local bee. Um, and the backyard is not my backyard, it's my friend Sarah's backyard, and you'll hear more about her today. But the whole range of what I'm talking about is not just buzzing creatures, but it's about how pollination happens in cities. Okay, here we go. Next, there we go. Now, a lot of the pictures, and a lot of them are pictures I've taken, are actually from my front yard, not my backyard. But same difference. The main thing I want to talk about is the amount of nature and specifically the amount of pollination that goes on in a city, in like your city, that you may not notice. Usually nature is something that we think about. Well, you go out into the country, um, and looking up Vaughan, I see there's a lot of opportunities to kind of just go out into the country, but there's actually a lot happening right where you're standing. Like if, for example, in this picture, there's two species, different species of bee and a swallowtail butterfly, all in my front yard. Um, so I wrote a book about pollination, and I like nature, but really I'm not someone that goes out in the country a whole lot. Um, and so I really do kind of like to pay attention to nature in cities, and there's quite a lot of it, especially right where I live, which is right next to High Park, which is one of the most beautiful parks in Toronto. Um, and I thought I would put that image up there because that's like right next to High Park, and that's a road going up and down Parkside Drive, and right next to a fire hydrant on a power console is a mural of a bee by a nature artist, nature street artist, Nick Sweetman. Um, this is my book, Paths of Pollen, and I tried to cover everything I could about pollination, and it is a more and more complex topic the more you get into it. I was going to say, yes, that's a picture of a bat on the cover. And many bat species are pollinators, but actually not any bats in Ontario. If you get down to, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and all the way south of there are all kinds of bats pollinating agaves, banana trees, all kinds of amazing things. In Ontario, bats are ecologically important, but mainly for eating insects and things like that. However, uh, pollinators are very, very diverse. And so that image I have right here right now is there's a picture of a butterfly. There's a picture of a bumblebee right in the center. The picture on the left there on top of that lovely purple flower is actually a fly. There are flies that look like bees. More on them in a minute. And a creature that we are very fortunate to have in North America and in Ontario, the beautiful, amazing hummingbird, which are actually very prolific, very powerful pollinators. They can move more pollen than bees. And because they're constantly feeding on nectar, they're constantly visiting flowers. Um, but bees themselves are incredibly diverse. Uh, Worldwide, there are over 20,000 species. And actually, the 20,000th species of bee was officially found at York University. So not far from where I'm sitting, or actually where Vaughan is, really. And I forget how far over 20,000 it is, but that's quite diverse for any kind of type of animal. There are more than 800 bee species native to Canada, and there are roughly 400 bee species native to Ontario, and you're just seeing like three right there. The one on top is called a cellophane bee. They actually live in holes, and they line it with cellophane created from cellulose. There's the agapostымен again, and then the red one is called a nomada bee or a nomad bee. And they are basically bandits. They basically lay their eggs in other bees' nests. There's a whole bunch of bees that we call cuckoo bees. They're not making honey. They're not working at all. They're just living off of others. That's nature's way sometimes. Um, Honeybees are not native here. They're not native to North America. They're not to say that there aren't millions of them in North America, but they're a managed species. They're actually native to Africa, Asia, and parts of Europe. More on those later. More on honeybees later. Um, but I'm mainly going to focus on native bees and uh, the bees that are native to North America, native to Ontario. And you may ask, well, so where are all of those things? 70% of them are in the ground, like the cellophane bee you saw the picture of earlier on. In fact, there she is again, her head poking out of a hole. Possibly the same one in the other picture, because I was with a group of kind of citizen scientists for something called Wild Bee Club. And so we would catch the bees in nets. That's a nest. We would catch them in nets and cool them down a bit to make them a little bit sleepy. And so we would take their pictures, keep track of what they are, and then let them go on with their lives. But um, you see that hole in the ground, and it kind of looks like a slightly bigger opening to an ant hole. And same kind of idea. And actually, bees are related to ants. They have the same ancestors that they evolved from. They're related to ants and also to wasps. Um, and then 30% of bees are what you call cavity nesters, or they're nesting in stems. Actually, honeybees are cavity nesters. In nature, they would live in trees. Um, but these species I have, the one on the right is from my friend Sarah's backyard. Sarah's an artist and a naturalist. And that picture was taken by her partner. Or actually, no, I took that picture. Sorry. The picture in the middle was taken by her partner, Rob Cruikshank. Um, and the one on the right is what you call the small carpenter bee, tiny little green things. And they like to live in stems. And then coming out of a bamboo stem, you have what you call masked bees. Uh, there's quite a lot of them because they're very small, and they really look like ants. And then on the left is an illustration of the larger carpenter bees. And you see them actually kind of in a group there, because carpenter bees, whether they're large or small, actually live in small groups. Uh, People thought that they were simply solitary. And that's something I forgot to tell you, actually, is that I think if you're used to kind of thinking about bees as like honeybees living in hives in groups of like many bees, uh, it turns out that most species of bee actually live by themselves uh, as single mothers, basically. Mothers taking care, laying eggs, making a life for their offspring um, with no help from males, because male bees don't do any work. Um, Now, my friend Sarah, that's not Sarah. That's actually a scientist. But the wooden structure there was kind of based on the idea of cavity nesters. Um, it was made for those kinds of bees. They like to live in tunnels, so she made a structure with tunnels in it. And there's a door on this little cabinet. You open the door, and you can see them living inside of tunnels. And so Susan Fry, a graduate student at the University of Toronto, is looking inside the cabinet with a lens, and she's listening to what they sound like. Um, and what you're seeing on the left there, the words are actually, I made some videos and I wrote some poems about some species of bee, and this one is actually the masked bee. And I'll show you one of my videos, just for like a couple of seconds here. So you can see there she is. Um, this is a mother, and you can see like four uh, blobs of pollen, which is pollen she's collected. And each blob of pollen is one of her babies. She laid an egg on top of it. The egg will catch a larva, will eat that pollen, and then eventually leave the tunnel about the same size as this one right there. So there she is working. And you can see that substance there, the kind of gauzy stuff, is actually cellophane made from plant cellulose. She kind of chewed it up and produced this substance on her own. Honeybees use wax, which they produce, and cellophane bees use cellophane. And we'll move on from her. And then there are leafcutter bees, which is, here's another bee living in one of the tunnels, Sarah's tunnels. And they actually collect bits of leaves from plants. And you might see sometimes plants in your garden will have these little kind of cookie cutter holes in them. And you're like, oh my God, what's eating the plants? You should actually be happy because it means that you have leafcutter bees around and they will pollinate your flowers. As you can see, that one bee who's working with the leaves, the structures they make are actually quite beautiful. And this one is all leaves, but I've actually seen leafcutter cells made with flower petals. And as you can imagine, quite lovely looking things. And then we have sweat bees, which is that's actually pretty much what most of the bees look like. They look like little flying ants. You can see again, there's the agapostemon bee, which I think the reason that it became Toronto's official bee, not just because it's common, because actually the other sweat bees in this image are also common, but it's beautiful. But most of these little tiny bees, the size of ants, really, are just nondescript, little dark nondescript creatures, and that is the majority of bee species. Sorry, but the truth is boring. And like sweat bees, yeah, here a little. There are 4,500 species of sweat bee. And then I have descriptions of some other types of bees, the most common kinds. And if you were a scientist who was trying to identify new bee species, they will drive you insane because they look nearly identical. You have to look at them under a microscope and see some small difference between them. And one scientist complained, he called them morphologically monotonous. But hey, and here's one in a primrose, a flower native to Ontario and much of the world. But yeah, just how easy are they to tell apart? How are they to tell apart? Well, there is a species discovered in Toronto, and there's a species discovered on Sable Island. Tell me the difference. I don't know. Anyway, bumblebees are native to North America, and they're very, very important pollinators because they are big and they pollinate a lot. And they are a social species like honeybees. So they have a queen and workers, but not thousands like you'd have in a beehive. You have like 50 to 500 individual bees. And they nest in the ground mostly. And what makes them important as one of the things that makes them important as pollinators is that they're generalist pollinators. Some of these smaller bees may stick to one kind of flower. Bumblebees will try anything. There's 250 species worldwide and over 40 species in Canada, 16 species in Ontario. Unfortunately, a couple of those species are critically endangered, and probably more will be declared endangered. You may have heard of the rusty patch bumblebee. You don't see it in Ontario anymore at all. But you see these ones, the common eastern bumblebee, the brown belted bumblebee, and then the red belted bumblebee, which is a weird bumblebee because sometimes they got this red mark on them and sometimes they don't. And you got to know, a lot of the time it's this thing, you don't know why it looks like that. It might be the red-belted bumblebee without a red belt. And then there are things that look like bumblebees, like carpenter bees. There's a picture of one. They have no hair on their back end. It's just this shiny abdomen. And then the thing on the right is not a bumblebee or a bee. It's a Narcissus bulb fly, which is a fly that looks like a bumblebee. Why does it look like a bumblebee? Because bumblebees sting, and that might discourage predators. So there's something called Batesian mimicry, where harmless creatures look like more harmful creatures to scare predators. And a lot of flies are like that. Here are some more. And that there's some flower flies that look sort of like bees, and I mean, like, not really if you look at close at them, but they fool a lot of creatures, and they fool humans. And so there's actually a picture I thought I would include on the right, which is the cover of the 2014 edition of Bees of the World, a scientific textbook, with a picture of a fly on the cover. So just keep that in your head for a moment, that flies, they annoy you. Yes, but many, many, many species of flies are pollinators, and they were pollinating millions of years before bees were. Speaking of millions of years ago, who were the first pollinators? I'll let you think about that for a second. I can't hear your answers, so just think about it. First hint, not bees. There you go. Second hint, right. Beetles are probably the earliest pollinators. They are certainly one of the oldest types of insects. And so I have in that image there, taken in Hyde Park, are two what they call blister beetles, mating in a flower. Now, honeybees, or bees in general, are going to flowers for food most of the time, as are flies, as are beetles. But there's other uses for a flower when you are the size of an insect, such as shelter to sleep in. I've found many creatures, many insects sleeping in flowers, sheltering in flowers, and mating in flowers. And if you're going to find beetles, you'll often find them mating. They're quite vigorous about that. And I included a picture of a Japanese beetle on the right, which is actually not a pollinator, at least not in North America. And they are an invasive species. So bees are diverse, but beetles are like many more times diverse than bees, or actually any other animal at all on Earth. And as a result, there's so much diversity. You have beetles that are pollinators, you have beetles that are plant predators, you have beetles that are pests, you have every kind of beetle. So their relationship ecologically with everything in nature is very complex. They're in every niche you could imagine, right? Butterflies are also pollinators. Butterflies themselves have a complex relationship with plants. They like nectar. Some of them eat pollen, but they also lay their eggs on particular plants. And they have very close relationships with them. I think a very commonly known one is the monarch butterfly and the milkweed. But I think these two butterflies, are both at this point consuming nectar from flowers. I mentioned the monarchs, and here are pictures of the monarch's life cycle. There's a monarch pupa, caterpillar, adult monarchs, not on milkweed, but actually on goldenrod. And then the lower right corner, I have a picture, an illustration of the milkweed. And the milkweed flower, if you look really close at it, it looks like it has these kind of teeth. And actually what happens is when a pollinator steps in that flower, a little trap closes around their leg, and they got to pull their leg out. And butterflies have long legs, and so they're able to pull themselves out, which is good. and then pollen is actually stuck to them uh, from the milkweed. So unlike creatures that collect pollen, this is kind of more like a pollen assault almost on the pollinators of milkweeds. There's orchids. A lot of orchids do things like that too. They just kind of forcibly stick pollen to their pollinators. Um, and there are also pollinating moths, and I have examples of that. There's a hawk moth pollinating or actually sipping nectar from a Jimson weed and getting pollen on its tongue. In the middle, I have an image of the Madagascar star orchid, which is amazing because the nectar is like a foot, more than a foot down inside the flower. And the Charles Darwin, who wrote Origin of the Species, researched this flower. He researched orchids a lot, and he kind of proved his evolution theory by going, well, there must be a moth with a tongue a foot long. And everybody was like, you're crazy. But he was right. Anyway, and then on the left is the yucca moth, which is a Central American moth that actually lives in a flower, lays its eggs in the flower, mates in the flower, and also pollinates the flower. These are some Ontario moths, which I've sort of seen with naturalist groups. How much are they pollinating these particular moths? There's actually not enough known about how moths pollinate because they're nocturnal creatures, and it's hard to find scientists to research anything that's up all night. There's just less research about anything that lives at, that kind of goes around and does their business at night. And of course we have hummingbirds. I will point out that the shapes of the flowers that hummingbirds have kind of perfectly fit those long beaks of theirs. So you have a lot of these kind of trumpet-like flowers, which you can see a hummingbird, a red-throated hummingbird is kind of putting their beak into, and it's a red flower. It's a bright red flower, and that's also worth noting because bees and most insects cannot see the color red. They can't tell it apart from other colors. However, they can see ultraviolet, and actually red poppies, which are pollinated like crazy by bees, they see these flowers not because they're red, but actually because they reflect a lot of ultraviolet light. But birds have incredible color vision. They see more colors than we do. I think they have an extra cone. We got 3, they have 4. But also look at the shape of the flower, and that's something that's important. Is flowers come in so many different shapes, sizes, and colors because pollinators come in so many shapes and sizes and colors. Or you could look at it the other way, that pollinators come in so many shapes and sizes and colors because flowers come in so many shapes and sizes and colors. And it's kind of chicken and egg. It goes both ways. But these are all native flowers to Ontario, and these are all flowers that I photographed in High Park on specifically like a botanical walk to kind of show the native species that are there in the park. And they're kind of jealously protected, those species. There are naturalists who do like prescribed burns and things like that to keep invasive species from overtaking them. But there's still a lot of invasive species even in kind of preserved natural areas. It's very hard to control them. And here's just an example of one crazy complex flower shape. This is the lavender iris, and I included a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, who very famously painted a lot of different flowers, including, I think, irises a few times. And on the left is an illustration of what happens when a bee goes into this flower. There's basically, if you look at it, there's kind of 3 different parts to the flower, which are kind of the same type of thing. um, you have these kind of flags sticking up, and you have this kind of part called a fall kind of swooping down. And that is kind of a flag pointing up from the flower. Hi, I am bright purple and blue. Please come see me. Um, and then a bee, which loves purple, which they would see more as blue because they can't see red. And then they land on the on that petal, which is like a landing strip for them. And then they have to go and get nectar and pollen. And by doing that, they have to kind of crawl into this small space. Um, and by doing that, they pick up pollen and they drop off pollen. So that's often the strategy of flowers, is to have a shape, well, to have colors that attract their pollinators, but then a shape that kind of makes sure that pollen ends up on the pollinators. Because the thing about pollinators is they're not trying to do what flowers are doing. Flowers are trying to have sex. Um, and oh yeah, I have some. This is a picture of many different types of flower sex organs, and they are male anthers, the male flower sex organ, and then the stigma, which is the female. The anther dust, kind of releases pollen. Pollinators pick it up, and the stigma sticks up, and it's sticky, and it receives the pollen. Pollen sticks to it. And I have a quotation from Carolus Linnaeus, who invented taxonomy, all the Latin names you have for species, but also he basically categorized plants by their sex, the type of sex organs they have, which in the 1700s offended and titillated many people, including his critics. One of them was Johann Sigisbeck, who was like thought this was a moral outrage. And then Linnaeus named a weedy plant after his critic. Anyway, closer picture of pollen. Pollen also comes in many shapes. And actually many shapes and sizes and even colors. A lot of it we see is yellow. For example, on the right, you'll see pine pollen, which is kind of the thing with the Mickey Mouse ears, because pollen from pines has no pollinators picking it up, so it has to float through the air on the wind to land on things. The one with all the stringy parts in the middle is actually from primrose, and it has like these stringy, sticky, silly string parts that kind of stick to the primrose pollinators. And then a lot of pollen, as you can tell, have these spiky parts so that they can stick to creatures like bees, which have, branched hairs that this pollen gets tangled up in. And you'll see that one of the images in the middle there has like kind of like a little kind of tube coming off of it. That's actually a pollen tube. And sperm cells travel down that once it gets into a flower. And then you have what they call double fertilization, which is you have two cells in the pollen. One of them produces a seed, one of them produces a fruit around the seed. There you go. But pollinators, creatures that pollinate, don't know about that. They don't care about that. They want pollen, which is a protein source. Bees, especially, they would have been wasps. Wasps are predators. They capture other insects, and that's the protein for their offspring. But bees went another way, and they collect pollen. And again, you can see pollen in one of the tunnels in one of Sarah's structures. Nectar is sugar water, and it is an energy source for many insects, including a monarch butterfly sipping from an echinacea, and a small carpenter bee sipping from a hairy beard tongue flower. Now we're going to kind of get into the conservation part, because we know that pollinators need food and they're going to flowers for food. They also need space. Habitat is a crucial thing for them. And they need enough space to find shelter. They need space to forage for food, seek mates, find food and water sources. They need a diverse landscape. The ground nesting bees, for example, need to find patches of ground to live in holes, or they need cover, ground cover to shelter, to hide, to shelter, to hibernate over winter. And they need diverse vegetation if you're going to have a diverse community. And that becomes the problem in cities. Cities have lots of diversity. They have many different kinds of plants. They have many different kinds of habitats, but they're fragmentary. And I have a couple of examples. I just got them today of, a couple of really fragmented looking parts of my neighborhood. And you have these weeds coming out, growing anyway, because nature tries to persist. But a lot of what there are certain traits that make things weeds. Yes, we don't like them. And we certain things and we think they're weeds, but one of the main kind of scientific reason or the definitions of a weed is that they grow well in disturbed habitats, and humans are experts at disturbing habitats. And there are many, many invasive plants which we have brought to cities. Oftentimes, they're even pretty things, like the Norway maple were brought from Europe as street trees, and you see a leaf from one there, because they're just unkillable practically. Unfortunately, they do not have the kind of the leaves like sugar maples that turn red in the fall, and they're overtaking sugar maples. Lily of the valley is actually a well-liked garden plant, but they're also an invasive plant. And the same with goutweed, which have these lovely two-colored leaves, except when they take over large spaces of like ravines and so on, and then they lose that lovely color, and they just kind of grow wild. They also poison the soil for other native species. There's also invasive creatures. I mentioned the Japanese beetle. There's the spongy moth, formerly known as the gypsy moth, but they decided to not call them gypsy anymore. And many invasive worms. There's some jumping worms, which are a big problem all over Ontario. Like I was recently at a talk at a horticultural society meeting, and this room full of gardeners were extremely excited to find out that somebody was selling soil without jumping worms in them. And there's a sign up for spraying for the gypsy moth, now the spongy moth, in High Park. So even a place like High Park, which is trying to preserve nature, may have to resort to pesticides to take care of invasive moths. Honeybees actually kind of are also on the list because they are a valuable species in agriculture. They are used to pollinate agricultural crops. They are not so beneficial to cities. If you look at a city as a place where you have kind of the remnants of native ecosystems with native plants and native pollinators, then you introduce this hyper efficient pollen and nectar gatherer. Honey comes from nectar. And then, of course, you have like entire cells full of pollen for thousands of bees, honeybees. So keeping honeybees in cities is actually an ecological disturbance. And I know many well-intentioned people who have kept honeybees to help pollinate, basically to assist nature. And actually, one of those people is Jode Roberts, and I have an excerpt from the David Suzuki Society, and I have an excerpt from his article, which he published last year, saying that he was giving up keeping hives after a study came out at McGill University which basically is showing that honeybees are uh, hurting the biodiversity of native species in urban ecosystems. Um, so if you want to help, what do you do? Well, you plant a garden. Um, Universally, everybody, any expert who's kind of saying, what can you do? Plant a garden. And there is my partner, Christina, working on our garden. And I would like to, I worked on it with her, but I would say Christina is kind of the genius of the garden. It's a beautiful garden because she basically had the aesthetic vision of it. Um, and some of the pictures I have in there are species that are doing really well this year. We have columbines, which are just busting out, and I'm adore them. So I love that. So I'm very happy about that. And then the other image I have is from kind of raspberry bushes, native raspberry bushes, which have their flowers. You can't eat the raspberries, but they're good for pollinators. Or you can eat them, but they're not tasty raspberries. We have strawberry plants with very good strawberries in them. But the thing about plants like raspberries is at the end of the season when the flowers have all dropped off and everything else, you'll see these hollow canes, which are places where stem nesting bees might want to live. And so it's good to not clean up all of those things to if you have things like that growing to actually leave the stems so things can live there. And our gardening effort is part of a project to produce a pollination corridor. Remember I mentioned the problem earlier that cities have a problem with fragmentation. Lots of good stuff, but it's not necessarily connected. And so there are campaigns to connect these things. I mentioned Joe Roberts. He's a great ecological publicist, and one of his creations was the Butterfly Way project. And you see there a kind of a logo for the Brantford Butterfly Way project. That's a nationwide project by the David Suzuki Foundation. And then we're part of a more local project called Project Swallowtail. You notice that both of these projects are named after butterflies, not bees, because some people are scared of bees, and everybody likes butterflies. So often these ecological projects are named after butterflies. And the point of the project is because so much of the land in the city has many, many different private owners. You need to reach hundreds, thousands of people and convince them to plant pollinator gardens. And the intention is to then have like a corridor where you have pollinators going from yard to yard to yard and finding flowers that sustain them. But there are larger projects than that. There's certainly big projects in Guelph. I know that Calgary is working on, like the city of Calgary is working on a pollination corridor. And there's a conservation group, which I have a map from them, and they're building a monarch butterfly way station. But actually, I'm looking at even just that image, and there's many, many different things. There's milkweed, but there's lots of other plants. So it's basically part of a pollination corridor. If you do start planting that garden, one of the most essential things is something blooming year round. And so I have from our garden, which is starting to work that way. There's a geranium. We have geraniums, which are growing quite well, and they bloom early in the year. And then I have an echinacea, a cone flower. Everybody likes cone flowers. I haven't seen a pollinator that doesn't like them, and they're often going midsummer. And then there's goldenrod, which is by the time you get to the fall, it's like everything is just yellow with these goldenrod flowers. A problem is with goldenrod, or problem goldenrod experiences is people mistake it for ragweed, and so they think that goldenrod, which is actually like kind of necessary to pollinators in the fall. It's like their last chance to have a meal. And some people think it's a weed. So heads up about that, learn the difference. And there's also, I mean, like that's something we actually tried to kind of raise some plants from seeds and then connect with other people who raise plants from seeds. I mean, for a while we had this little kind of free butterfly plants giveaway station. And again, Christina, who's kind of the artistic one of the two of us, designed the box. We're actually really not that great at growing things from seeds, so we actually didn't do it this year. Citizen science, that's something I've been involved with a lot. And I mentioned kind of putting bees on ice for a minute to catalog them in High Park. That's one thing you see right there. You see in the same kind of study, you see a little bee with pollen on her legs hanging from a pencil. And then one of the young person in the photo there are actually part of like a moth identification group. So I've gone out sometimes with these moth enthusiasts. Not for morning people. It's a very nocturnal hobby. I encourage you to go out and explore. And you know your area better than I am, but I was looking some things up and I noticed that you have the Maple Nature Reserve Nature Walk just outside of Vaughan. So I'll leave that there for you. And then also ways to get informed. I have a couple of books to mention. How to Make a Pollinator Garden, a free book you can get in a PDF form by Clement Kent, who is a bee scientist and also one of the founders of Project Swallowtail. And then there is a book, Grow Me Instead, which is very good. It's kind of the Ontario Invasive Plants Invasive Species Council has different pamphlets for to identify what invasive species are, but also what to grow instead of them, because this happened to me. I had things that looked like they were beautiful, pretty flowers, but they were actually invasive. So there's very, you can learn the difference and still have and grow things and have a beautiful garden. So those are two important and useful resources. I'll point you to this book, A Garden for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, or actually any of the books by Lorraine Johnson. She has many, many wonderful books about pollinator gardening. She's like way more informed about this sort of thing than me. And this book she co-wrote with Sheila Kalla, who's an expert on bumblebees. And actually, she was the person who ended up on Quirks and Quarks and all these things a decade ago, letting everybody know that the rusty patch bumblebee was endangered. And of course, you can always get my book. I'll leave that there for you. Everything that I've talked about today is covered to some extent in my book, Paths of Pollen. It's available on Amazon, or any kind of other book buying source you may want. You can also find it at public libraries, including the Vaughan Public Library. And now I think there's maybe a minute or some minutes for questions if you have any.